Well, we are going to turn our attention now to the Indian subcontinent and some just unbelievable suppression of the press there. And we are very honored, as we always are, to have back with us here on the show Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's always an honor to have you here on the show. Just a couple days ago, we saw a major raid against many people affiliated with the progressive independent news site NewsClick in India. There's a number of legal proceedings happening around them, but maybe just to start, explain to us what took place with this attack, this raid, this very major event in terms of press freedom in India.
Yeah, well, starting at about 6:30 in the morning on October 3rd, about 500 officers from the Delhi police force carried out simultaneous raids on about 100 residences. And I'm saying about because, again, this is there's still being information being compiled. These raids took place, again, at 100 residences of people who in some way are associated to the progressive outlet NewsClick, People's Dispatch, and Tricontinental Research Services. And what's interesting is that of these 100 people, some were current employees, some were former employees who haven't worked there in years, some had written maybe one or two articles for the site. There was, a famous comedian who was also had his house raided. The majority of these 100 people also got their phones and their computers confiscated by the police. And if you're doing journalism in 2023, you're essentially debilitating them. You're not really allowing them to work. And so this took place again on the morning of October 3rd. People were told that this was being carried out in relation to a case under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And that they were investigating NewsClick and members of NewsClick under this anti-terror law, and that it had to do with accusations that NewsClick was part of a pro-China propaganda network. And throughout this day, again, these raids took anywhere between 1 hour, if people were lucky, to 10 hours. Very, very intense interrogation and questioning. About 50 people were actually brought from their residences to the Delhi police station where they were continued to be interrogated. At the end of the day, 2 people were arrested. Prabir Purkayasa, the editor-in-chief and founder of NewsClick, as well as Amit Chakraborty, who is the administrator of NewsClick. And they are being charged under the infamous UAPA and remain detained until today.
And Zoe, of course, this took place not long after there was this New York Times hit piece that mentioned the outlets you're talking about, specifically framing them as like China propaganda outlets as part of this U.S. Cold War on anyone and anything progressive that opposes a new Cold War. This was the New York Times. I want to point out the paper of record, supposedly a bastion of liberal media, essentially giving ammunition with zero evidence, by the way, to a fascist government in India that I want to note. I would assume the New York Times and the many bylines of people who wrote this article were aware of the fact that these outlets have been targeted by the Indian government for a couple of years now. So can you talk a bit about what these outlets cover, the kind of politics they have, and why they may have ended up being targeted by what is essentially a fascist government?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that the New York Times was likely aware, because actually in the original piece, when they mentioned NewsClick and they link to NewsClick and a People's Dispatch video, they say that this site has been under investigation by the Indian government as part of attacks against progressive media in the country. So even in the first piece, they were admitting that NewsClick has been, suffering from persecution from the state. Even admitting that it has these political motivations. And New York Times itself actually covered the raids on Tuesday. And not only in their headline, but also several times throughout the piece, they mentioned that this raid was essentially carried out with the sole evidence of the New York Times, what they call to be an investigation, and I think what many of us call a hit piece and a baseless, just kind of a compilation of baseless accusations. So it is interesting that they were seemingly quite aware of exactly what they were getting into when they made these accusations, yet they persisted. And yeah, again, what does NewsClick do? Why is it being targeted? The persecution against NewsClick started in February 2021. This was at the moment where, if people remember, the Indian farmers' struggle was at the peak, where farmers had been camping out outside the capital, New Delhi, for a year, demanding that the government withdraw these extremely anti-people farming laws, which sought to bring more corporate investment in the sector and further make their rights more vulnerable in a situation where Indian farmers were already really suffering. And NewsClick was one of the major outlets that was, and at the same time, we also know that India was suffering from a horrific COVID outbreak. And at this time, people at NewsClick were traveling outside the capital, were going to these farmers' campsites where they were speaking to farmers, learning about why they had been camping there for months, why they were in this protest camp, why it was important to them. And they were bringing these incredible reports from the ground and really shining a light on this struggle, which was really silenced for a long time. And this, again, is not the first time that NewsClick had been covering the farmers' struggle. We know that in 2017, there was a massive, massive farmers' struggle in the state of Maharashtra. There had been many other instances of struggles that just had not really been given the time of day in corporate media. In India, the media concentration is very, very severe. And so at the same time that corporations are buying up media, are shutting down media outlets, local media outlets, and concentrating them in these big media conglomerates, there's also been a process of kicking out any progressive voices from mainstream media who voice opposition to BJP policies, who want to share about the struggles that people are going through, who want to, share the voices of people who are really suffering in this time. They've been kicked out of these media houses. And NewsClick has actually simultaneously been a space for progressive mainstream voices to really come and be able to share their beliefs, to be able to share their reporting. And so it's for exactly this reason why it has been targeted. NewsClick is not alone in being targeted by the Modi government. There's been several raids and persecution against other media outlets as well. Even big human rights and charity organizations. Oxfam in India has also suffered pretty intense persecution. We know the BBC was raided over the documentary that was shining light on the crimes of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And so this attack is part of a very, very comprehensive attack on all dissenting voices in the country, all voices that are saying that what is happening right now, whether it be the Citizenship Amendment Act, whether it be these anti-farmer laws, whether it be the attacks on workers' rights, is not correct, and it's not the correct direction for the country, and that the people are actually on the streets and fighting back against this.
Well, and it seems, and I'm glad you made that point, that many people have seen this raid as something of an inflection point. Of course, the so-called Unlawful Activities Prevention Act has been used, so-called counterterrorism, to silence many different people. And the response, it seems, has been very broad. I mean, going outside of, the so-called quote-unquote left into many sections of Indian society and around the world. And it seems that many people are very concerned if NewsClick is allowed to be persecuted like this, it could essentially mean the end of India's post-colonial democratic system. So talk, if you could, a little bit about what the response has been inside of India, because I think it's been quite notable how many people have made statements about this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's been really an outpouring of support. The Press Club of India has consistently stood by NewsClick in defending it against these heinous attacks over the past couple of years, and this has not been an exception. Even on the same day while the raids were taking place, there was an emergency meeting Dozens and dozens of journalists attended to voice their support to NewsClick. And since then, the press club has hosted several different rallies, press clubs in cities across the country. The Students' Federation of India has called for nationwide protests. So we've seen that at university campuses and cities across the country, students and young people are mobilizing and rejecting these attacks, even from liberal sectors as well. What's interesting is that even in these attacks against NewsClick following the publication of the New York Times hit piece back in August, the right wing used this to even attack the Congress party and Rahul Gandhi. And so we've seen even these liberal sectors from Congress and from other kind of mainstream parties voice support for NewsClick, reject this, because I think it's really showing what does this mean? It's an attack on democracy. It's an attack on civil liberties. Again, as I said, there have been many different instances where human rights organizations have been threatened, where journalists are under attack. And again, this is 100 people targeted in one morning is a serious departure. And it's one of the most expansive acts of repression that has been seen, again, as you said, in recent history. So I think that it has really shaken people, and there has been such broad support precisely because of what it implies for really anyone in India who is not for the government's policies right now.
Mm-hmm.
It really cannot be stated enough times that the New York Times played a role in one of the most egregious acts against press freedom, like you said, that we've seen by a fascist government. And yeah, you're right. They did cover it this week and literally essentially took credit for it, stating openly. And in it, they even call the Modi government that, basically a bad government and a right-wing government. And they say openly that this outlet is being targeted for its opposition to the right-wing policies of the Modi government, while at the same time also taking credit for smearing this outlet and giving this government and its police forces ammunition to arrest, to interrogate and go after journalists, over 100 journalists, and detain like 50? I mean, this is absolutely insane. The New York Times, this is just me opining now, but it's just completely outrageous. The New York Times should be ashamed of itself. But Zoe, I want to ask you, people who are watching should, I hope, be horrified and might be wondering, is there something they can do to help support press freedom, the press freedom of your colleagues in India?
Yeah, definitely. Well, in the next hour, we're going to be publishing an open letter on People's Dispatch that has such fine signatories such as yourselves. It's really important in this moment to show that our colleagues are not isolated. They're not alone. So please check out this letter, sign on to it. Follow NewsClick, share these statements. Add your voice. I want to add that when people were being interrogated, the questions really focused around whether they were covering such crucial issues like all of these different protests that I mentioned. They said, well, have you written anything that's against India? Have you covered India's response to COVID, which, by the way, cost over 1 million lives, even though it's not officially reported as such? So I think that this information, it really shines a light on the political nature of this persecution, of this attack on press freedom. And so right now, to stand with NewsClick, follow NewsClick, follow People's Dispatch. We'll be updating regularly on the situation. If you're with an organization, publish a statement, share information about the case on social media. It's so important to not stay silent. Because at the same time this is happening in India, we know that this could happen anywhere. Right now, we're in such a difficult moment where rights and liberties that once maybe we held as taken for granted are definitely being made more vulnerable by governments that want to silence any voice that is against war, that is for the people. And so we have to stand with NewsClick today to make sure that tomorrow we can continue reporting, we can continue in this profession. And as people of conscience, this is extremely important.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think the point you made there at the end is crucial. I mean, as NewsClick itself has made in its own response to this, to say that it's anti-India to report on the farmers' protests or the workers' protests is to say that the workers and the farmers of India, the majority of the country, are in fact enemies of the state. And I think that says everything you really need to know about the orientation of the government there of India, and perhaps there's some confusion about that, but it'll clear it up. Well, as always, Zoe, really appreciate you joining us here on the freedom side, and definitely I would encourage folks to continue to check out People's Dispatch and NewsClick. But of course, thanks so much for giving us some of your very precious time here.
Thanks so much for having me.